China on public goods.
So, hello. My name is Carsten Svaneborg. I am from the University of Southern Denmark in Denmark. And I will give you an introduction to molecular dynamics, an overview of different techniques in molecular dynamics, and some of the applications that we do with this. And let's get on with it. First, to put things into perspective, right, we have Brazil. Right, we have Brazil, Europe, and Germany. Germany is where Svaneborg is from. And you cannot really see it, but on top of Germany there's a very small land in Denmark. And Christiano and I worked for I don't know how many years in Aarhus, which is the second biggest city in Denmark. And now they did not want to give me any more money at the university there, so I'm now working at the university down here. But this is Denmark, and well, this is what it looked like 1 month ago. So basically snow all over. And we've certainly come to a different part of the country, I mean, where you have lots and lots and lots of heat compared to what we have right now. Okay, my interests are to do computer simulations of coarse-grained models of complex fluids or soft condensed matter, depending on what kind of name you want to assign to this. And what I think is interesting about these systems are the capability of self-assembly, and then you have emergent material properties. Like you have complex molecules, these complex molecules aggregate, organize, create materials, and these materials have very complex properties. And how do we understand the material properties from the molecular properties? This, I think, is a very fascinating field of study. And what could these molecules be? Well, they could be polymers, surfactants, liquid crystals, I mean, basically everything you can imagine. And of course, I would argue that computer simulation is the only real way to understand this. And then you can disagree with me if you want. So I'm currently employed at the Center for Fundamental Living Technology. What does this really mean? Well, we're not even sure ourselves. But the point is that we want to produce soft matter systems that we call protocells that consist of a container, which could be a lipid vesicle or surfactant covered oil droplet, or it could also be a gel or a macroscopic droplet of something. But this container should be equipped with a metabolic reaction, so it should be able to do chemistry. And what the current implementation is based on ruthenium complexes that can harvest light, they can take energy from the light, use that to drive chemical reactions inside these containers. And what they do is that they produce new material of the container itself. Then the goal is to also have information molecules, which could be DNA or XNA or some other molecule containing information. This molecule should also be capable of self-replication, and we want to couple the information content of this molecule to the metabolic reaction, such that we have information controlling chemical reactions, producing soft matter systems. And the goal is that the entire system, consisting of container, metabolic reaction, and information molecules, can display information controlled growth and division, i.e. self-replication. If we have a soft matter system that can display self-replication, then the ultimate goal is to have it capable of evolutionary adaptation of the information content subject to the environment we put this system into. And what this basically is a physiochemical model of the basic minimum requirements for having life, living systems. So this is why we are living in the title. With technology, we are still not sure what this really means. So what I mean, from my point of view, what I think is interesting is we have self-assembly, but we also have self-organization in terms of evolutionary dynamics on top of the self-assembly of soft matter systems that are driven far out of thermodynamic equilibrium. And this is one of the things that I'm using computer simulations to study. But this is not what I'm going to talk about right now. So basically, I have 3 hours of lecture, so I can bore you for 3 hours. And my goal is to start out giving you an overview of different simulation techniques and some examples of this, so that you have a kind of scope over the field. And I hope this complements what Kalina was talking about. And I'm also going to discuss a bit Monte Carlo simulations. I'm not going to explain anything, but kind of use this also as, what is the difference between the kind of simulations that molecular dynamic-based simulations and the Monte Carlo simulations. This afternoon I want to discuss some practical issues. This is good if you want to run simulations. If you don't want to run simulations, I'm afraid it will probably be a bit boring. But I think if you want to run simulations, you need to have some practical knowledge about what goes on inside the computer when you're running a simulation. And I'll end up, I will discuss parallelism, some techniques for optimizing simulations, and finally I'll end up giving you an example running a simple simulation on my computer, showing how to analyze the results, which is, right, if you want to run a simulation, you can download the source code of the simulation program, you can get my input files, and you can start doing your own simulations tomorrow. But I will tell you this afternoon how to do it. And then tomorrow I'm going to talk about what we can use simulation techniques to in relation to polymer theory. I spent a long time doing polymer theory, so I'm going to talk not as much about simulations as what can you do with simulations, what is the, like, compared to experiment, what can simulations contribute that experiment cannot do. And perhaps, I hope, convince you that we have really contributed and pushed polymer theory along by doing simulations and by doing clever simulations. And perhaps I will end up discussing DNA dynamics at the end. Okay, so where did all this business of molecular dynamic simulation start? And where it started is the very most simple system you can imagine, that is that of a Lennard-Jones liquid. So if you assume that you have a liquid comprising of neutral point particles, and the only interaction they have is through van der Waals, then we can ask, what is the liquid structure? And this is, if you want to do theory for liquid structure, this is amazingly complicated theoretical to do. And there's books about it, you can throw yourself at them and spend a life trying to figure out how to do theory for liquid structure. Or you can download the simulation code and have the result in a few hours. So this is why I would argue simulations can really contribute here. And this is where the fields of molecular dynamics started. We also want, if I have a liquid, what is the phase diagram of this liquid? How is this related to the molecular interactions of these particles? So this is where it started. Where are we? Well, this is a cartoon of where we are. Now we have very complex shaped particles. They are interacting with very complex interactions. But again, we want to know what is the liquid structure of complex particles and complex interactions. What is the phase diagram of these materials if you change pressure, temperature, and so on? Secondly, what are the properties, if we regard this as a material, what are the properties of such a material? And for instance, we could imagine that we could deform it. Then we could discuss what are the elastic properties of such a material, and how are these elastic properties related to the shape and interactions of the molecules inside. Or we could shear it, and we could discuss the rheological properties of these materials. And this is something we can do, and which is fun. And I think this is one place where simulations can contribute a lot. So just to give you an overview of some types of simulations what I will be talking about is what I call mesoscopic simulations. Mesoscopic means that we are not dealing with atoms. We don't care about atoms. What we want to care about is we want to care about beads. What is a bead? Well, a bead could be an entire molecule, it could be many molecules, or it could be part of a complex molecule. And then we want to build out or build up systems of these beads and how they interact. So I cannot tell you anything about atoms and real what is the interaction between atoms. But what we can do using these mesoscopic simulation techniques is that we can generate very, very big systems. So big systems that they do have material properties. And this is very difficult if you want to simulate something with atomistic detail. I mean, if you have one molecule and 1,000 molecules of water like what you was simulating, this is a far cry from carrying a material. But we can in no way simulate a system that is large enough to have material properties if we have atom detail. So we are forced to figuring out how can we describe the system in a much coarser way. I'm going to return to that, but this is the fundamental idea of doing mesoscopic simulations. So here are, for instance, this is something from our group. This is an oil drop that is covered by surfactants and some information molecules, and you can then study information molecule replication on the surface of such soft metal systems. You can study division of these systems. Vesicles, we can study dynamics of vesicles. I'm going to return to this. Or, for instance, we can do liquid crystals. Again, what we can see is that one single molecule is here represented by one single particle. Not a simple contact particle, but an elongated particle. And then there's my own stuff where we take polymer molecules and represent them in a very coarse way, just as a string or a string of beads. And then we can create materials built out of polymers that are nothing more than beads connected by springs. And I'm going to return to this in the third lecture, so I don't want to say more about that. So we can imagine a kind of phase diagram of simulation techniques, and this depends on what are you interested in. Right? You also, always when you do science, we have to ask what are we really interested in, and then find the techniques that are optimal for what we want to study. So if you want to study, for instance, bond vibration or chemical bond dynamics, right? Or what Ken was showing about this color, how molecules change absorbance and emissions in different solvents, we need to understand what goes on at the level. But if you, for instance, want to simulate or study diffusion of lipids or micelles or even vesicles, you can see these occur at much larger time scales, and they occur at much larger length scales. And in that case, we need to use much more coarse methods, or we need to use mesoscopic methods for studying these molecules or studying these systems. So, but there's a range of techniques going from doing hard quantum simulations, where I think state of the art is 200 electrons, up to atomistic simulations, coarse-grained simulations. What we have been running is millions of beads in some of our simulations, even more mesoscale simulations where you can almost touch real time in terms of seconds. And then the PPD, I will talk about later, will be almost up in the range of fluid dynamics. And then of course in fluid dynamics, even further up here you have continuum mechanics, if you want to describe it with continuum theory like fluid mechanics or continuum elasticity theory. So the point is, depending on what we want to study, you need to pick different simulation techniques. You need to pick different levels of description of your system. And here are some of the techniques. If you want to do really microscopic studies, then we want to study the electron and nuclear dynamics. And this would be computational quantum mechanics or density functional theory. Or it would be doing atomistic simulations with AIMBA or one of these other force fields. But if you want to study coarse grain mesoscopic techniques, well then we can apply Monte Carlo or molecular dynamics, Brownian dynamics, or dissipated particle dynamics. And I'm going to introduce these three red ones to you. And if you want to study the properties of very large lengths and timescales, you could do continuum modeling of fluid dynamics. And I'm not going to mention this. I mean, many engineers are working in this field. Many chemists are doing this, and I think many physicists are probably somewhere in the middle. So these are the three techniques I will discuss. Okay, if you want to do molecular dynamics, the basic assumption is we assume that we know how our particles are interacting. This will either be through some empirical interaction potential, or it could be something we obtain from quantum simulations. So we assume that we know the interaction potential. The goal is then, if we study the statistical mechanics of a system of particles that are interacting with this interaction potential, and how we do this? Well, we can choose some dynamic method, which would be molecular dynamic, Brownian dynamics, DVD dynamics. This will generate a trajectory of the system, and from this trajectory we can analyze it, and we can study the statistical properties of observables. And these observables could be things like, it could be the pressure, it could be the average energy, it could be the free energy, or it could be correlation functions of observables, which gives us the dynamic properties of the system, such as diffusion constants, or electrophoretic mobilities, and or response to deformation. We can do many things. So this is the basic overview. And the very simplest dynamic you can imagine is just Newtonian dynamic. This is what we all learn in school, and what it says is that mass time acceleration is equal to force. But what is force? Well, we know force is minus the gradient of the potential. So if we know the potential, we can calculate the force. If we know the force, we can calculate how particles move. And this is the basic idea about molecular dynamics. It's in relatively not even deeper than that. So the point is, we input the position of all particles at t equals to 0, then we can use this equation of motion when we know the potential to calculate what is the position of all at other times. The problem, we assume that we know the position, the initial position of everything, the potential. How do we get the position at a later time? This is the fundamental problem of Newtonian dynamics. And there's many ways of doing this. One of them is the delay algorithm, which is very simple. The idea is we can Taylor expand the position, the current position plus delta t. That's the current position minus, it says plus the velocity delta t plus 1/2 of the acceleration delta t squared. But this is just a Taylor expansion of the trajectory of a single particle. You can also do that for minus t. And what happens is that the velocity term changes sign, and also the third order term. So if we take the sum of these two equations, we can say, well, the position of the particle j at time t plus delta t plus the position of the particle at t minus delta t, well, that has to be, I was summing these two, it has to be 2 times the current position. These two terms drop out, plus the acceleration times delta t squared. And then the third order term drops out, and you end up with some fourth order term. And what is the acceleration? Well, remember the acceleration was just related to the force, the interaction potential. So the rule for updating the position becomes, and I've done nothing more than move this term on the other side, is to say the position of the jth particle 1 time step further in time is 2 times the current position minus the previous position plus the force that the jth particle is experiencing from its environment divided by its mass. And in a similar way, you can just write down what is the velocity of the jth particle at time t. But this is the definition of what is differential. So this gives us a rule of how to propagate the system in time. So a basic molecular dynamics algorithm would say, well, we initialize the position of all particles at time equal to 0, we initialize all their velocities, and then we repeat calculating the force acting on J from all its neighbors of J, and then we use the relay algorithm to update positions and velocities. Every once in a while we store the position of everything so we can analyze the equations. We add delta t to time, and then we continue doing this. We're just propagating the system one delta t at a time. And of course, there's some details to this, but this is the conceptual basis of doing molecular dynamics. It's not complicated. But we have to think a bit more. If I have a system here, we have a particle A, and that particle has a certain cutoff distance of its interaction. We have a particle B over here. How should we treat the boundary of our system? Unfortunately, when you do molecular dynamics, while all computers are too small, you always want to simulate systems that are much larger than what we can actually simulate. So we invariably have to deal with what happens at the boundary. I mean, many beats will always be at the boundary in a simulation, so we cannot just neglect that we have a boundary. And the way to treat it, or one way to treat such a boundary, is to assume that we just replicate this box periodically. So we just replicate all the particles in the box, and what happens is we use what is called the minimum unit convention, that particle A is interacting with all the other particles inside this interaction radius, including the image particles. So suddenly A and B appears to be far away from each other, but because of periodic images, A and B are really interacting with each other. And that is a very simple way of handling the boundaries. So let me take an example, like a Jones liquid, and basically just see what can we do with this. So for instance, argon or noble gas atoms, they take two van der Waals interactions, and an approximation of the van der Waals interaction is given by this empirical expression. And one can show that when you have induced dipole interactions, these depend as minus r to the power 6. And then the question is, we also know that noble gas atoms, or any atoms, do not like to be on top of each other. We need some repulsion at short distances. And there's various ways of doing this. If you want to do computer simulations, you also have to ask what is fast. And what is very fast is if you already calculated this term to the power 6, you can just take this term squared and then you get it to power 12. And this is gives you a steep repulsion. So the sum of these two terms gives you what is known as the Svaneborg potential. And Kalina already talked about this potential, and that many people have studied what happens when you play around with these exponents. And essentially it's all the same. I mean, there's no deep physics in playing around with this. So what it's characterized by is that for distances larger than 2 or 2.5, there's no interaction. Then there's a short range attraction due to induced dipole interactions, and then at very short distances there's a very, very steep repulsion. Well, what is the? I mean, I just conjured up this potential, claiming that well, it has to have the dimension of energy. It has to have a certain distance. Otherwise, the expression is dimensionally wrong. But what does epsilon really mean? What does sigma really mean? Well, this depends on the kind of molecule that we want the atom that we want the potential to represent. So what we can do and what we always do when we do simulations is we don't worry about this. So what we do is we pick sigma as a unit of length. You can see it has dimensions of length. We pick epsilon as the unit of energy. And then we pick m in the equation motion as the unit of mass. We can also then define a unit of time, a unit of temperature, and then we can do the simulation in reduced units, in which case the reduced force is just the same as acceleration, and the reduced Jones potential is just 4 times a dimensionless distance, which is the distance r divided by sigma. And with this choice, we can do one simulation of this potential, which represents one state point, but it can represent many atoms, depending on what numbers we pick for sigma, epsilon, and mass when we have a particular atom that we want to compare to. So we can do one simulation and represent many atoms. And here's a table of how to convert from a given atom to what is epsilon and what is sigma. So this is again, people have studied these different atoms, and I'm not sure all, for instance, fluorine. And, I mean, this is good for noble gases, but for some of the other ones, right, we're trying to approximate their interactions to a Lennard-Jones potential, which might be good or it might be bad. But, right, for instance, if you take krypton or argon, you can look up the table, what is the characteristic energy of the Lennard-Jones potential, what is the distance of the Lennard-Jones potential, if we want to represent the interactions of this atom with a Lennard-Jones potential. And if we pick argon, the values were this one for the energy, this one for the length, and we know what is the mass of argon. And then we can plug that in, and we can convert temperature, reduce temperature into 1. If we convert temperature units using this energy, we get our 120 Kelvin. We can take reduced density of 1. What does that mean? Well, in real units, for argon, using these mapping numbers for argon, we get a certain density, time, we get a certain time, you see a roughly femtosecond time, and pressure 1, we get this pressure. So we can do simulations at different reduced units, and then using these expressions like this, map these into real units that we can simulate, or we can compare the simulation results to experimental results for the same states. So one thing I haven't mentioned is temperature. It's quite a bit hot here, and when you do Newtonian dynamics, the problem is that you do not have a clear temperature definition. So how can we get temperature out of this? Well, what we can do is we can. Am I running out of power? No. We can define the average kinetic energy just by summing the kinetic energy for all the particles divided by n. And we know by the partition theorem that the average kinetic energy is 1/2 kBt. This is per particle. Okay, this is also the average kinetic energy per particle. So this means that we can just flip 1/2 kBt to the other side and define temperature, which is kinetic temperature, through this relation. So if we do a simulation, we can claim that we are doing a simulation at a certain given temperature just by measuring the kinetic energy. The kinetic energy is readily available as simulation. So to summarize, what do we know about Newtonian mechanics? Well, we know the total energy, the linear and the angular momenta are all conserved. This means that what we are sending when we're doing a simulation with Newtonian dynamics is a microcanonical PVE ensemble, because we know energy is conserved in Newtonian dynamics, and there's no way to control temperature. We can take the kinetic energy and convert it into a kinetic temperature, but we cannot control temperature with Newtonian dynamics. This should not come as a surprise if you take a course on Newtonian dynamics. I mean, the teacher will never discuss temperature. I mean, well, what does temperature mean in relation to Newtonian dynamics? And one could say many interesting things about that, but I will not do that. Instead, I'll discuss how can we control temperature. Because when you do experiments, well, what you control in an experiment is not the energy, but control is the temperature. Okay, but before I do that, I just want to discuss numerical issues. But the point is that we can look at this delta t. I introduced the time step of the update algorithm, and we can discuss if we have two systems, how far do these two systems diverge from each other as function of the time step we take. And what you can see is we take a small time step, they diverge from each other quite rapidly, but then they end up being some distance away from each other. If you take a finer time step, this divergence happens more slowly, but ultimately after 100 or 1,000 steps or so, we end up in an equally bad situation. And we can also look at the divergence of energy and see it's roughly constantly, and then suddenly it's going to explode. And the smaller a time step you take, well, the longer the energy stays conserved, but ultimately it explodes. And this is it's a problem, but because it means that you can only run simulations for a short while until the energy, we don't have energy conservation anymore. And this is of course because we pick up numerical errors in this integration scheme. And irregardless of how short, irregardless of how short time step you take, sooner or later we are going to run into this problem. So we should pick the time step to be much smaller than the fast characteristic time of the system dynamics. Otherwise, the numerical integration is very stupid. But it should also be as large as possible because it takes time. If you take a time step 10 times shorter, the simulation will take 10 times longer to get to the same point. The typical value is around 50 seconds. And because of numerical errors associated with density, the energy is not exactly conserved, especially for long runs. The Newtonian dynamics, we know that the Newtonian equation of motion is time reversible, but when we integrate it numerically, it's not exactly time reversible. And furthermore, we know that if you take two almost identical systems in probably in time, they are going to diverge chaotically. So this is a problem, but the advantage is that we are in reality not interested in the representatives of the trajectory. What we are interested in is the statistical properties of the system which we obtain by doing averages over the trajectory. So this is not as bad as it might seem. But there's ways of getting around it. And that's what I'll continue with. So just to summarize, if you do Newtonian molecular dynamics, it's conceptually very simple. We can do virtual experiments on our simulation. We can finish measuring what we measure in a scattering experiment. We can measure that in the simulation in the Mars, and we can carry out essentially any kind of experiment virtually during the simulation. We can start things like reconstructive phase diagrams, material properties, and so on. The disadvantage is we need a small time step, and we can only run relatively short trajectories before the energy diverges. We can only run relatively small systems, and we are sending the NVIDIA sample without temperature control. So how can we introduce temperature control? That's the question. And for this, you need to thermostat the simulation, just like when an experiment you couple it to a thermostat, and then you have a well-defined temperature for your experimental situation. So the goal is that most experiments that are carried out, but not at constant energy, but they're carried out at constant temperature. So we need to couple our simulation to a heat bath. And here, for instance, like somebody thrown the laptop into the freezer, you want to couple it to a heat bath. It's a cold laptop, but it does not necessarily work for the simulation. And how can we do this? And there's many ways to do this, some good, some bad. And what is good and bad is always complicated because it depends on what you want to do. But a conceptually simple way is to not use the Newton equation of motion, but to use the Boltzmann equation of motion. So what we do is we add a friction term and a stochastic force. And the friction term couples to velocity, the stochastic force is just a kick. And one can show analytically that if we want a Langevin dynamic to converge to an equilibrium, these random kicks have to have an average zero, and they have to have a certain correlation with a certain prefactor, so they're not correlated in time, and the kicks of different particles are not correlated. But what happens is you can see there's a prefactor of kBt, so the temperature rises. And of course what happens is that when we kick the system, we add heat to the system, but when we have friction, we remove heat from the system. And it's this coupling between adding heat and removing heat that means that we have a well-defined temperature ultimately. Right, so the combination of friction and random forces couples each individual particle to a heat bath, and this means that we can now control the system temperature by controlling the relative strength of these two effects. Very simple. So what would the Brownian dynamics algorithm look like? Well, it's almost the same as in molecular dynamics algorithm. Again, we take the interaction forces, and now we need to generate and add a random force. We add need to add friction force, but again you use the relay update to update positions, again assembly configurations, and essentially the same algorithm, but now with temperature. So let me just show you an example. So this is a Lennard-Jones liquid. Each particle here is interacting with its neighbors for a Lennard-Jones potential, and this is a temperature 4, which means that this is in a liquid state. When I say temperature 4, I mean 4 in reduced simulation units. And it will just continue like that forever. But now we could ask what happens if we wanted instead to decrease the temperature. Now we're just going to increase the speed of the simulation a bit. And what you cannot see, but what will be apparent is that these particles are not moving as fast as they did before. Essentially what has happened is that they crystallized into a hexagonal order. And this is just by taking the previous simulation and saying, I do not want to simulate the temperature 4, I want to simulate the temperature 1. Then it extracts heat from the system, and the system crystallizes as we expect. Very simple. So what did we know about long-term dynamics? It has an advantage that we can simulate very long trajectories, because now we don't have to worry about the energy diverging, because all the time we put in energy and we put out energy. So we have a well-defined temperature, and we can run for as long as we want. And the state of the art at the moment is nanosecond to microsecond simulations. And we have actually run simulations for so long that the number of time steps, which we counted in a 32-bit integer, overflowed. This is 2.9 billion time steps. And then Gary that was running the simulations wondered, why is the simulation always crashing at a certain time step? Well, I mean, it's not really surprising, because suddenly you have 2.9 billion time steps, you add 1, and because you only have 32 bits, the next time step is 0. So they had to change the simulation code to use 64-bit counters. We were the first ones that actually broke that limit of that. So what we can do is now we can make samples in the INCT ensemble. Again, we can carry out any virtual experiment that we want to do, and we can again study liquid structure, phase diagram, material properties, now as function of temperature and not energy, because we do not really know how to relate energy in the simulation to energy in the experiment. But again, we have a disadvantage. We are using relatively short time steps. We cannot make the time steps faster than the dynamic of what the particles, how they're moving. And still we are confined to using relatively small system sizes. But so now, Gaussian dynamic is, I would say, is a very neat way of doing molecular dynamics with temperature control. But we can do better. But first I will give you an example. How much time do I have? 20 minutes, okay. So let me introduce one more potential to you. So previously I had the Lennard-Jones potential, which has a minimum. But what we can do is we can take the positive branch of the Lennard-Jones potential, just add a constant to it, and then set it to 0 at the minimum. And when you do this, you get the red potential. So it's the Lennard-Jones potential plus a constant, and then I define it to be 0 for this distance and above. And I need this perhaps a bit strange construction, because remember when we're doing molecular dynamics, we're calculating forces as the gradient of the potential. So we have to have a potential that is differentiable, otherwise the simulation will explode like mad. So this is one way to create what is an approximate hard-sphere interaction. So if I take this potential, I can start to make mixtures of particles. And I'm going to show you a simulation where red particles are interacting with red particles through a full Lennard-Jones potential, green particles through full Lennard-Jones potential. But the red and the green particles are interacting with each other through this cut-off potential, which means that these ones will have a low energy if they're close to each other, but these ones will have a high energy under all circumstances, so they do not want to be close to each other. And then I've used certain rules for how to mix what is the red-red and the red-green interactions. And if I run this type of simulation, what you can see is that I'm starting out at the initial random configuration, and as time passes, green particles like to be in the vicinity of green particles, red particles want to be in the vicinity of red particles, and red particles really need to be close to green particles. And the system here is then showing what's called Svaneborg decomposition. So we can study the dynamics of Svaneborg decomposition in this very simple way. And if I speed up, what you can see is that the domain sizes are growing, but the structure actually remains. It looks similar, but the scale is growing, but the structure remains the same, which is characteristic of Svaneborg decomposition with these fractal scaling patterns. What we can also do is to glue together different bead springs. I haven't talked about that yet, but I'm just using simple harmonic springs. And again, I can control how the things interact with each other. So I can, for instance, make a model given, and I can say heads like to interact with heads, tails like to interact with tails, but heads would like to really hate to interact with tails. So again, this is essentially the same simulation as before, with two different types of particles, except now they're not free to move and make Svaneborg decomposition. They somehow have to minimize the energy subject to their molecular constraint. And of course what they're going to do is they're going to assemble into micelles. But so this is surfactant self-assembly. And I'm just using these three interactions. I'm using springs to keep some beads together. I'm using Jones interactions to make heads attract head and tail attract tail. And then I'm using these cut off Jones interactions, which is just repulsive for everything that doesn't like each other. But if it doesn't like each other, they should not be on top of each other. Need a repulsive force. And what you can see is I just have self-assembly, and you could make a beautiful small study of the dynamics of self-assembly and how these things grow and interact. Of course, I can also play around with the size. What happens if I change the size of the particles, but I keep the interaction parameters the same? What you can see again, of course, I get self-assembly, but I get these long worm-like micelles. So this is essentially playing. Yes. The number of particles is conserved, so I have the size of the system is conserved. But ultimately what can happen is that everything assembles into one big micelle. But thermal fluctuations would tend to break these apart because there's a translation into if you're
If there is a limited size, what is the difference?
I don't know.
You can use some extra constraints to allow this to go up to a certain size.
I mean, the size is determined by the free energy, and the free energy, of course, is determined by, in this simulation for surfactants, right, this is going to be the curvature of the ends that is going to determine it, and you have exponential size distribution because of the ends that are contributing to the free energy. And here, what I've done is I've just released one of the particles so it can move freely, but again, the head, I have one head and one tail. And what you see is that you get these oil droplets that are covered by surfactants. Again, you can just study the dynamics of these things. And this took me something like half an hour just to set up. Okay, so in the last 15 minutes I'm going to discuss dissipated particle dynamics, and I think I'll be done. So the idea of dissipated particle dynamics is to say that, again, right, I discussed this, that I'm using mesoscopic simulations where one bead can represent the whole molecule. But we can do things that are even more wild and say one single bead can represent many water molecules. So we could in principle say we could pick either 3 or maybe 1 million water molecules and represent this by a single bead. And then the question becomes, what are the effective interactions between these beads? And this is what is known as the dissipated particle dynamic method. And I think originally this was just made up as this would be a very nice idea of what is interaction potential. And later what I've derived what is the relative interaction potential of this model. very similar to the Langevin dynamic. You have a conservative force contribution, you have a stochastic or dissipative friction type term, and you have a random term picking each particle. So the conservative is the forces again minus the gradient of the potential, but the dissipative and the random forces have these particular expressions, and they are given by some dampening function, meaning that two particles should not interact if they are too far apart. But we do not a priori know what this is. Again, there's a random force that has also some dampening function, and what Rij means is it's just a vector from the ith beat to the jth beat. In Rj is the reduced vector from the ith beat to the jth beat divided by the distance, and then Rij is distance between the two beats. So you essentially just postulate, well, maybe this is better than Langevin dynamic. But then you can analyze it and see what happens. And one can show analytically that the friction or the kicking terms should have a mean zero, such that we are not an average pumping in energy. They should have a certain symmetry property, and I will return to that. And the kicks of different particles are correlated in a strange way, but they're not correlated in time. And then the prefactor of the, just like the Langevin equation, we have a relation between the prefactor of friction and the prefactor of how much you kick. Here we also have a prefactor or a relation between how much you can see the sigma controls how much you kick, and the gamma controls how much energy you dissipate. And again, there's a relation between dissipation and kicking. And one can analyze, one can do simulations like the Lennard-Jones simulation I showed you. Take this coarse grain, make it on the Lennard-Jones liquid, and try to calculate what are the interactions between these coarse grain DBD particles. And one can show that this can be represented reasonably well by just a triangular weighting function. So this is 1 at distance 0, is 2 at distance 0, and then it cuts off to 0 at certain critical distance. And one thing that is very important in the DBD liquid model is that I showed you this is the term for the expression for the dissipated particle. But let's try to calculate what is the expression for the JI. Like this is the Ij interaction. What is the JI interaction? Right then I just get JI. But what happens is that the vector between the I and J positions is just minus the vector between the J and the I, right? So this vector between J and I is minus the vector between I and J. Right? This is obvious by symmetry. In the same way, the reduced vector between I and J becomes minus the reduced vector between J and I. So when you do this flipping, all of these just change sign. And what you end up with is that the contribution, by the dissipative term for the Ij particle, is minus that of the Ji particle. And if you do the same analysis for the random force, what you can see is if this term is symmetric in Ij, what you get is that you get the random force for Ji is equal to minus the random force of Ij. What happens with this particular choice is that you essentially kick one atom, but you do the same kick on the other atom in all interacting pairs. So you do not put in any net momentum in the simulation. And this is what is very special about the DBD thermostat. It conserves local momentum. And the Langevin dynamic does not do this. And what is the consequence of preserving local momentum? Well, I'm saying it a few slides more or further on. But what it does is it actually reproduces correct hydrodynamics. When you introduce friction that takes out momentum, it's the same thing as screening hydrodynamic interactions. the DPD liquid with this very particular choice of dissipation term and random force term. They have been designed in exactly such a way to preserve local momentum. Otherwise, right, you would not worry about having something that's complicated looking as this. There has to be some benefit. And finally, the typical choice for the pair interaction is just to take a certain interaction at the distance. Well, let me draw it. What it looks like is like this. We have it cut off a certain distance. We have a certain interaction ij at distance 0, and it just cuts off. And this also means that particles can be on top of each other, because compared to the Lennard-Jones interaction, with the Lennard-Jones interaction would diverge, avoiding particles sitting on top of each other. But with these very soft interactions, particles can sit on top of each other if they want, but it's going to cost an energy term of Aij. And just to return, what do we mean by Ri? This is not, or such a B. This represents a whole volume element in a liquid, or it could represent a whole molecule if we have lipids inside the liquid. And these volume elements interact through soft repulsive forces that we represent with this very simple potential. And this also means that volume elements can pass through each other. And if we change these parameters, then we can control if certain beads attract or repel each other. And this can drive either macroscopic or microscopic phase separations. And there's no mappings of what this Aij parameter means in comparison to Florer-Huggins theory for phase separations of polymers. So this is a very neat way of doing, for instance, polymer simulations of the microphase separations of block polymers. This is what many people are using DPD for. Okay, and if you join bead by harmonic rings, as I said, we can build model polymers and liquids. And again, we can define natural units for the DPD dynamic. So what can one do with DPD simulations? We can simulate, here we have lipids, and as time passes, these lipids self-assemble into a bilayer. And you can simulate very large patches of bilayer because the model is so simple. And we can simulate how the undulation of these things couple because it has the right hydrodynamics. That would not be the case if we try to do this with a Langevin dynamic. Or if we try to model the lipids as I did with surfactants with the Lennard-Jones interactions, then we could never simulate a system that is large enough to show bilayer self-assembly. Here's even more complex, where you see they have self-assembly into some strange phase with defects going on. So this is work of Ara Cook and Marcus Deserno when they were at the Max Planck Institute in Mainz. Here you see a DPD simulation where you start out having a vesicle which is composed of a mixture of lipids. These lipids want to phase separate on the vesicle, but because they have different preferred curvature, that leads to essentially budding off of parts of the vesicle, so you get a pure vesicle with one lipid and then another lipid, and of course this one would bud off and we would end up having two vesicles with pure lipid in them. And another one, again this is the dynamics of vesicles, also using this DPD method. So what do we know about DPD dynamics? It produces samples from the in vitro ensemble, and it has the correct hydrodynamics. Because it has soft interactions, it means that we can simulate the very long time steps. So instead of using femtosecond time steps as we would in either molecular dynamics or Brownian dynamics, we can use, for instance, microsecond long time steps, which means that we can propagate systems much further in time, exactly because we have these soft interactions. So this DPD can be up to 10 to the 4 times faster than doing MD simulation. Because the description is so very crude, we can simulate very large systems, and the DPD equations of motion can be related to fluid dynamics. You can essentially convert them into a Navier-Stokes equation, so you know exactly what is the properties of the DPD liquid. And again, we can study liquid structure, phase diagrams, material properties. But now we can also study what happens when you have hydrodynamic coupling between particles. What are the disadvantages? It's difficult to take AIJ when you have some AIJ parameters, interaction parameters for beads, and say how are these related to the properties of molecules. Okay, perfect. And the DPD liquid is not really, water. It can be described as Navier-Stokes equation, so it is a liquid, but it does not have the properties of water. And actually what you know from simulations is it's very difficult to simulate something with the properties of water. People are still trying to get pure water and understand the properties of pure water. And there's many simulations where they're trying to study water. And this is a much coarser way to represent the properties of liquid. So, the DPD liquid is not water, but it has hydrodynamics. So, to summarize, several known simulation techniques exist, and they have known and well-defined analytical relations to statistical mechanics or fluid dynamics. So, for instance, we know, for instance, we can do Newtonian dynamics, we know we can convert this into Liouville dynamics, and we can study the properties of a sample propagated with Liouville dynamics and so on. So there's theory, much analytic theory behind these things, which means that these algorithms are not something that you just conjure out of the air. It might be that you conjure them out of the air, but then you can write papers about this algorithm represents a certain Liouville dynamics in do analytical, statistical, or analytical, mechanical, or analytical, statistical, mechanical calculations of this. The simulations allows us to study the physics of mesoscopic models at various lengths and timescales using well-defined statistical mechanical ensembles, and they can be efficiently implemented and simulated on the computers we have. I'll discuss this later this afternoon. The disadvantage is there's no single algorithm that can do everything. You need to know what you want to do, you need to know what is the algorithm that is most optimal for doing what you want to do, and you need to know how to run it on the computer so that you get the results as fast as possible. So this requires knowledge of what you are doing. So you cannot just download the simulation code, produce results. Well, you can do this, but it might not be physically meaningful. And always, we need lots of computers to run the simulations. The more computers we have, the better. And this is a good thing because computers are cheap, whereas experiments are expensive. So this could also be called an advantage. Okay, I think I'll talk about the relations between molecular dynamics and Monte Carlo and good books later, after lunch. So, questions?
Questions, folks?
The curvature energy, you do not, we specify how head groups, the size of head groups and how they're interacting, the size of the tail groups and how they're interacting. And the curvature energy arises out of that. Right? So I cannot tell you what is the curvature energy. So if you say, I want this curvature energy, I can play around with the interaction to reproduce it, but I cannot tell you a priori, just from knowing my interactions, what is the curvature energy. There is one, because I built the model to have an interface energy or a curvature energy depending on the tails, the structure of the tail. But I cannot a priori tell you what it is.
Our molecules are dimensional, or you can put a dimension, for example, if you have larger than
That's what I did in this Facton simulation. So the head is twice as big as the tail, for instance, and that again dictates what is the curvature energy of the micelles.
Yeah, because if you have a big head and a small tail, the product will better with the
Yeah.
pose around you.
Yes, yes. And you could see that from the simulation. Let me. But here they are all equally big, and what you can see is it self-assembles into essentially rod-like structures. Where if I make the head very big, the tail very small, they self-assemble into small spherical micelles. So yes, I mean there's a curvature energy certainly.
One central point of this is to know how the interactions are. But if you do not exactly know how, let's say, parts of your system can do this interaction, how can you search for it?
I mean, this is trial and error. I mean, either you have some chemical insights in, you know that maybe there's a bit of charge there, so maybe you want to add some spring charge interaction. Maybe you know that the molecule is a bit stiff, so that some angles has to be constrained in some way. But I mean, essentially, right, when you do mesoscopic simulations, we have some interaction potential, and that defines a model of the liquid. And this model might be good or it might be bad. And if it's bad, we have to change the interactions to make it agree better with the experiment. So ultimately, it's a question of comparing to experiment. I mean, it's too complicated. I mean, how can I from these interactions predict the structure? I mean, this would be solving the statistical mechanical problem. But if you can solve the statistical mechanical problem, you don't need to do the simulations. So, right, you can do anything with the simulations that you cannot do analytically. But of course, if you could do it analytically, you just write it down on the blackboard and not spend a month of computer time on it.
And you can get an idea of the critical distance concentration.
Yes. I mean, in this simulation, right, I could just change the number, right, I could just change the density of them and see when does myself start to appear. Right, so I could do exactly the kind of experiment that you would do, changing the concentration. And then looking at density of micelles, I could look at scattering as function of concentration and see if suddenly I have the appearance of micelles. Or I could look at the surface energy between the liquid and the head group maybe, and I could see if, or maybe the tail, right, between the tail and the liquid particles, I could calculate or look at that energy and see how that depends on concentration. Because when the tail groups are in the micelle, they'll be screened from interaction with the liquid. So that should drop at certain concentration. So I can measure the micelle concentration as function of the interaction potential in many different ways. I just cannot tell you what it is a priori.
More questions? If not, let's take Carsten again. Carsten?